This week, we're going to be talking about recruitment and selection. So our first set of slides will look at recruitment. Second set of slides will look more at the selection process itself. In terms of recruitment, we know that one of the primary generic management skills that every manager needs to have is staffing of organizations. First step in staffing of organization entails recruitment. And when we go through a recruitment process, there are two main perspectives that we're always interested in. First perspective is the employer perspective. So we're looking at what are the factors that affect a successful hiring recruitment process for our organization. So we're looking at it from that organizational perspective. Secondly, we also have to take into account the perspective of the individual applicants themselves. What do they feel about the quality of the recruitment process itself, regardless of what happened in that process, whether they got the job or did not get the job? Did they think it was a quality process? Did they feel that they were valued and that they were protected throughout that process? So we're concerned about it from an organizational perspective, but also concerned about it from an applicant perspective as well. So what are some of the other questions that we ask when we are trying to figure out these employer and applicant perspectives on the recruitment process? How does this recruitment process embody the goals of the organization? Ostensibly, we'll have a strategic plan in our organization. That strategic plan will establish goals that we are trying to achieve. How does the recruitment process fit with those goals, either those official long-term goals or some of those shorter-term operative goals that we have established within that strategic planning process? Were enough strategies used in order to create a broad enough applicant pool so that we can be assured that we are interviewing and selecting interested and qualified applicants? Is the process aggressive enough to encourage the best and the brightest to apply for these positions? Is the process sufficiently clear and non-bureaucratic so that would-be employees are not discouraged? If the process is too lengthy, if there are too many bureaucratic hurdles that people have to jump through to get through the recruitment process, we are going to lose some of those best and brightest applicants. We know one of the primary challenges in the public sector is the lengthy nature of our recruitment process. Because of our emphasis not just on efficiency of hiring, but also an emphasis placed upon making sure that we have a representative bureaucracy, that our bureaucracy represents the subgroups that it should be representing in the population, to make sure that we are protecting individual rights and treating people in a fair and equitable manner. It means that our recruitment process is going to be much lengthier than the recruitment process that we typically see over in the private sector. So we understand that and we recognize it's going to be a lengthy process, but we don't want to make the process lengthier by adding in more bureaucratic hurdles that don't really need to be in that process. How do our applicants feel about the recruitment process? Do they feel good about the recruitment process, or are they frustrated by the number of hurdles and the amount of time that the process is taking? And then we have to look at a recruitment process from a cost effectiveness perspective as well. So what are the benefits of this process? What are the costs of this process? And are the costs that we are incurring throughout this recruitment process, are those costs more than the benefits that we will get from filling this position? So kind of a quick cost effectiveness analysis has to be taken into account as well in looking at both the effectiveness as well as the efficiency of our recruitment process. Well, what else? What other factors can impact a successful recruitment process? The size and availability of our labor pool. In some of your previous courses, especially if you've taken courses in organization theory and behavior, you've probably talked about the School of Organization Culture. And the School of Organization Culture talks a lot about how the culture of the organization is influenced by the surrounding environment, kind of like a systems theory type of perspective. There are some environments that are very capable of supporting organizations. There are other environments that are not capable of supporting organizations. Those more capable environments tend to be those environments that have those adequate and available labor pools. If the environment's not providing us with an adequate labor pool, then obviously we're probably not going to be able to hire the best and brightest person to fit this position. The location of jobs. So where are these jobs located? If they're located in places where people don't want to live and work, then it's going to be much more difficult, obviously, to fill those positions. In the wake of COVID, there's always a question of teleworking and remote work. If there are remote work aspects to this position, that may be more attractive because it provides that flexibility to our applicants. So we might get a bigger, more robust applicant pool. Pay and benefits. We know that historically in the public sector, we have lower compensation levels than in corollary organizations in the private sector. So if we are paying a very low salary and we don't have great benefits, obviously that's going to negatively impact our recruitment process. Job quality. How well has this position been defined? Does the organization understand what this position is and why this position is necessary? If the organization doesn't understand that, then prospective applicants will not understand that either. The image of the organization. This gets back to some classic writings from people like Charles Goodsell in his Case for Bureaucracy from way back in the 1970s. Whenever members of the public hold a public organization in very low esteem, it's going to make it difficult for us to recruit people to work in those organizations. So how respected is the organization among the population, among its environment? Economic boom or bust. And so what's the economy? In good economic times, then it may be a different situation hiring people as compared to times of economic stress. In good economic times where there are a lot of organizations that are hiring and very low unemployment rates, we're going to have a lot of competition in our recruitment process as opposed to if it's a poor economy. And then some of the more non-economic ways that the organization contributes to an employee's welfare. So how will the organization contribute to the employee's welfare beyond just pay and benefits? How can the organization help that employee take advantage of professional development opportunities in order to, from a more human resource management perspective, develop their skills and develop their abilities as human resources? From an applicant perspective, applicants typically want to be treated as consumers in this recruitment process, that they are essentially the consumers and they are shopping around for employers that will best meet their wants, needs, and desires. And so that type of competition will have an impact upon the success of our recruitment process. So, four different suggestions that are provided for employers who want to make a good impression of the agency. As soon as agencies have narrowed their field, so what we'll do is we'll have a long list, and then that list obviously will then get narrowed down to a shorter list. We need to identify those applicants who are not proceeding further in the process. There may be future positions that are available, and you may want some applicants who are not going to proceed in this process to maybe join and proceed in a new process for a different type of position that they may have a better fit for. They also will have friends and family who may be wanting to apply for a position. So you want to keep these good PR types of relationships with your applicants, even those applicants who are not making it through the process. Good candidates also expect recruitment processes to result in a timely notification of their status. And one of the more difficult things to deal with when you are engaged in hiring is to continuously receive phone calls and emails from applicants saying, where's the process at? Where am I at in the process? Because ostensibly, they're not just applying to your organization, they're applying to multiple organizations as well. So you keep even those who are in the process aware of the process itself and what point of the process they are currently in. People tend to prefer information that is detailed enough to allow realistic assumptions about that specific job. So they want that information to be detailed enough so that they can make informed decisions about whether or not to continue through that recruitment process or to move on to another offer they may have received from another employer. Then the interview process, candidates not only notice whether they meet top organizational leaders and coworkers, but they're also sensitive to how their time is utilized. So they will essentially know the people who are interviewing them, the people who are reviewing their credentials. And if they view these people who are reviewing their credentials as people who are not very high in the organization structure, then they're going to feel that they're not very valued in this process. And obviously, it's going to give them a very negative view of the recruitment process. In recruitment, there are typically three main stages to any recruitment process. The first stage is planning and approval of the position announcement itself. then the preparation of that position announcement, and then selection and use of specific strategies that will be used to then garner that applicant pool. That's typically known as the staffing process. So as we go through the steps, these three steps in recruitment, one of the things that we have seen is that a lot of governmental organizations have really moved toward a decentralization process in recruitment, whereby in the past, if you know anything about the civil service system, especially at the federal level and the Civil Service Reform Act, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, the Civil Service Reform Act created a very centralized recruitment process where recruitment was very much centralized in the Office of Personnel Management. Well, since the 1970s, we have learned that that doesn't work all that well, that different organizations have different types of positions, they need different types of employees. So therefore, we've seen a great decentralization of staffing activities from OPM down to the individual agency and departmental level. Organizations are also very focused on selling their organizations to prospective employees, understanding that high quality applicants are going to have a lot of other opportunities, not just in the public sector, but also in the private and nonprofit sector as well. So organizations have really begun to sell themselves through their recruitment processes. And they started experimenting with new staffing strategies as well. Instead of just relying upon examinations, we now have more holistic reviews of knowledge, skills, and abilities. We have the use of assessment centers where individual candidates are brought in on maybe a Saturday morning and are given the opportunity to actually do the type of work that they would be doing if hired into the position. That's a newer, more innovative type of recruitment strategy. So in planning and approval, what we need to do is we need to obtain the approval to actually go out there and hire for this position. Now, in the public sector, obtaining that approval is a multi-step process. And just to give you an example of how it is done at a state university in a state type of environment, is that you not only need approval to hire a faculty member from the academic side, from the dean's office and from the provost's office, but you also need to have approval from the Office of Equity and Diversity. And so as you construct that initial position announcement, first, you have to get approval to go out there and hire to begin with, and then you also have to have an approval process for that job announcement itself. If you're going to do an effective job of recruiting, not only do you need the approval of all these different organizations within your organization, but you also need to do a good job with strategic planning. We know that strategic planning is elemental to pretty much everything that the organization does, from its day-to-day activities to how it staffs its employees, to how it pays its employees and makes its expenditures, to how it evaluates itself in terms of is it accomplishing what it's supposed to accomplish. You need to have your recruitment process established within that strategic planning process itself. So in order to know whether or not you need to staff these positions, you're going to have to come up with a staffing plan. You'll go out there as part of your strategic planning process and you'll do a labor market survey. You'll see what types of positions corollary organizations in your environment have, what types of positions they have been hiring for, what types of positions are needed in order to meet the wants, needs, and desires of your constituents, as well as what's the ability of that external environment to support your organization through the staffing process. So you go out there and do a needs analysis. And as you do your needs assessment, you will include in that needs assessment a variety of different things. One thing you want to include in your needs assessment, succession planning. We know that for many years in the public sector, we have been talking about the retirement tsunami and how we have an aging workforce, and eventually all those the baby boomers are going to be retiring, and Gen Xers in the near future will be retiring as well. And so we've been waiting for this retirement tsunami. We waited and we waited, and that retirement tsunami never really happened until we hit the COVID-19 pandemic. In the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw a lot of people decide not to return to work, especially some leaders who are very close to retirement. And so if you don't have a good succession planning in place, you're not going to be able to replace those individuals. You need to have some type of a succession plan in place where younger employees are mentored by your more veteran employees. So when those more veteran employees are ready to retire, those younger employees have the requisite skills and abilities to then take on those leadership positions. We need to identify the new skills and staffing needed to prepare for the future. So we have these technological advancements, AI, for example. How are we going to deal with AI in public administration in the future? When we are looking at who will be our leaders of our organizations, they need to have those types of technological abilities in order to become those effective leaders. The impact of the local, state, and national economy should also be part of our needs assessment. So if we're dealing in a situation where we have a contraction of resources at the state or the local level because of some of the economic strains from the post-COVID-19 pandemic, we're going to have to take that into account. If we have policy changes at the national level that will take away some of the grant funding or some of the appropriations that we normally enjoy as an organization, we're going to have to try and take that into account as well. What are the training and professional development considerations that we need to develop? And so, do we have to have training and development, PD, in place for these new employees so that if they don't have the skills they need, they can then acquire those skills? Or they can acquire new skill sets as the demands change in the external environment. Organization really needs to have a clear sense of the demographics and the competition of the job market, as well as the direction of the organization. We need to know what's going on in the demographic profile of our surrounding environment, and then know how competitive this job market is going to be in the future. Again, all parts of this needs assessment that we'll do in this planning and approval phase. There are some red flags that we need to be aware of in a flawed hiring process. Things such as applicants recent positions have been determined to be poorly qualified. If that's a situation, that could emerge from a variety of reasons. Number one, maybe our environment doesn't have the capacity or the willingness to provide an adequate labor pool that we can select from. Perhaps we have not done a good job of defining the position and the requisite requirements of that position. So there is a mismatch between the position and then the skills that these applicants have who are applying for these positions. When we have supervisors who are complaining that new workers do not fit well into the department, that's another red flag for our hiring process. Perhaps we're not doing a good enough job of aligning our hiring process with the culture and the goals of the organization. If the best candidates are not applying, it means those best candidates are not attracted to this position in this organization and they're going elsewhere. If better applicants have already found jobs by the time that they are offered a position, that's another red flag in our process. It means our process is too lengthy and has far too many bureaucratic hurdles. So some of the fundamental questions that we are going to have to consider before we fill a vacant position in our organization, because not all vacant positions need to be filled. And that's the first question. Does this vacant position need to be filled at all? In times of budget contraction, we see organizations saving money primarily through attrition. And so a position opens up, and well, we don't need to refill that position. We can reallocate some of the job duties from that position onto other positions, and therefore it will save us money by not filling the position. So not every position needs to be filled. If a position is deemed as necessary and it does need to be filled, does that position need to be reclassified? In our civil service system, we have a system of position classification with our pay grades and our pay bands. Positions can be reclassified if the substance of that position has changed over the years. So if you have a long-term employee who has been in this position for many years and that person then retires, you then go to fill that position. Maybe over those years, that position has fundamentally changed. And some of the requirements of that position, some of the job duties of that position, those job duties have changed. And so therefore, that position deserves a reclassification study to see whether or not it needs to be reclassified. So if we're looking at something at the federal level, maybe a job is classified as a GS-11, but we've noticed that the requirements of that job have changed, the duties of that job have changed substantially enough so that we have to reclassify it from a GS-11 to a GS-12. That obviously that reclassification is going to cost us a lot of money to do the reclassification study. And then that GS-12 position will have to be compensated at a higher level than a GS-11 position. So there are certainly costs that are associated with that reclassification. Also, reclassification can become a very slippery slope, where if you reclassify one position, then other employees in other positions, they will then request a reclassification as well. And so it becomes a reclassification study on top of a reclassification study. How are we going to advertise this position? So are we going to advertise it externally or just internally? So in answering that question, it really does depend upon what you need out of this position. Do you need new skill sets that are not reflected currently in your organization? That will then have to be an external type of hire. Internal recruitment would be reserved for a position where the person who is getting that job needs to know the organization very well. An example of that is oftentimes we hire interim associate deans. So we have an associate dean that leaves for whatever reason. We have to hire an interim associate dean. Those interim associate deans are typically internal recruitment processes because it's an interim position, it's a temporary position, and you also need someone who can hit the ground running, who really knows the college and knows the university. Individual recruitment versus institutional or pool recruitment. Pool recruitment, cluster recruitment has become very popular these days, where you'll hire someone who can work across a variety of different departments and a variety of different units. This is something that's very common now in faculty hiring. So if you hire someone to teach research methods, you understand that research methods in political science and public administration and criminal justice and sociology, those research methods are relatively similar across those different disciplines. So you can do a cluster pool hire where you can hire someone who is able to work across all those different departments. Some other preliminary decisions you have to make about the positions that you are filling. Who and how many will be involved in the selection for that position? So who's going to be doing the hiring? Does the employment opportunity require a specialist or a generalist? Again, do you need someone who specializes in one area or someone who's more of a generalist, like that person who can teach research methods across a variety of different disciplines? And you have to acquire the authority and approval for job adjustments needed after the posting. So once you have posted that position, you may recognize that there need to be some changes made to that position. And so you need to get approval and authority and approval every time you make any changes to that position, to that job announcement. You also have to realize that the recruitment process begins long before a position becomes available. Again, your recruitment needs to be integrated into your strategic planning process. So high-performing agencies will design the appropriate process to recruit the best and brightest, and oftentimes incorporate that within their strategic planning process itself, because you want this position to have a very clear fit with the goals and the objectives of the organization. You cannot have that clear fit unless it aligns with the goals and the objectives that were established in that strategic plan. So you then go out there to recruit. You have to fashion this position announcement. And I think we're all familiar with position announcements. The position announcement will list the position title. It will list the classification for that position. And then that classification will then be attached to a pay grade or a pay band so that you know the range of compensation for that position as well. That position announcement will then also include the functions of the position, the types of things, the types of tasks that are done on a daily basis in this position, and oftentimes the percentage of the amount of the day that is spent on each one of these types of tasks. If there are any physical types of requirements, lifting requirements, or anything like that, that's also listed then in your position announcement. You'll then also list any education or experience requirement. Typically, what we'll do is we'll have required types of expectations for education and experience, and then we'll have preferred qualifications. And so, your basic required qualification may be a bachelor's degree and 10 years of experience. You may allow that, 5 years of that experience could then be replaced with a master's degree, and maybe your preferred qualifications would be some other type of postgraduate degree, a PhD, a law degree, or something like that. That would then be your preferred type of qualification. Then also we include in these position announcements, we will also include a some type of a statement about diversity and how we respect diversity as an organization, and we I won't say prioritize, but we encourage applications from members of underrepresented communities. So typically we include all that information in these position announcements. These position announcements then have to be approved. Again, not just internally, but also oftentimes approved by some type of an Office of Equity and Diversity. So not just your HR office, but oftentimes Equity and Diversity will also have to approve that announcement. Those announcements are typically then today placed online, and so we'll identify a variety of different online sources. Whenever we do hiring, what we have to do is we have to demonstrate that the online sources we are using for our position announcements, that those online sources reach diverse audiences. And so when you're hiring a faculty position, you'll not only advertise in the Chronicle of Higher Education, you'll advertise in what I call publicsectorcareers.org. That's another one. We'll also advertise sometimes in the section, the public administration section for women in public administration, and a variety of other than targeted types of online sources. So there are numerous methods that you can use in order to contact and inform potential applicants about the job opportunities within your organization. Obviously, as we've discussed, that job posting, personal contact recruitment. Sometimes what we'll do in order to diversify our applicant pool is I will reach out to the chairs and directors of doctoral programs that have a track record of providing PhDs to members from underrepresented communities. And so I might reach out to a USC, or reach out to Texas Southern, or reach out to some HBCUs in order to try and make that personal contact to enhance the diversity of the applicant pool. Newspaper recruitments, trade journals, PA Times is one of the primary trade journals that you can advertise in for public administration jobs. Internship recruitment, headhunting firms. Headhunting firms are typically used for your upper level leadership types of positions. So if you're hiring for, a director of an agency, or you're hiring for in the academic setting, a dean or a provost, oftentimes you use a headhunting firm for that. Better jobs always include a substantial interview process. And so you'll always have some interview process associated with this recruitment strategy that you are using. Obviously, you're expecting a lot in those interviews, and you expect a lot not just from the applicant, but you expect a lot of preparation from those who are conducting the interviews as well. So practicing those interviews, both from an interviewer as well as an interviewee perspective, that type of practice is very important. As we mentioned before, we promote diversity in recruitment. We know that the underlying values of public administration are not just efficiency and effectiveness, but also creating a representative bureaucracy, fostering social equity and social justice. And so in order to do that, we need to do a good job of encouraging a diverse applicant pool. Does the organization provide an environment that is capable for diversity through promotion processes and organization culture? So it goes beyond just putting together that diverse applicant pool, but it also involves the culture of the organization, making sure that you have promotional opportunities that are available for diverse candidates once they join the organization, that you have professional development and training opportunities that are available for those employees, that you have mentoring programs that are available for those employees as well. And so it's really very much this conscious attempt to try and maintain this well-rounded workforce so that no group has any legitimate complaints about not feeling that they belong in the organization. But understanding how to incorporate diversity in the recruitment plan is obviously going to be very important for all organizations. Dividing up the responsibilities. And so who is involved in recruitment? Some organizations will use a centralized human resource office. They will oversee the general diversity plans. They'll provide a comprehensive listing of recruitment sources. They'll provide coordination of institutional recruitment efforts. Sometimes across the organization, if you have multiple divisions or departments that are doing recruitment at the same time, obviously you buy in bulk. And so you buy your advertisements in bulk and you get a much better price for that. That's something the centralized human resource department can handle for you. Full-time human resource coordinators with personnel responsibilities. These are human resource specialists who will be involved in the process and oftentimes have overlapping duties with the departmental leaders as well. So sometimes, for instance, when you'll have an interview, you'll not only have representatives there from the department, but you'll also have human resource coordinators who participate in those interviews as well. That's very helpful to make sure that the questions that are being asked in a legal manner, that there's no necessarily preference being given to one candidate over another, and that human resource coordinator can then kind of keep things in line in terms of making sure everything is being done in a legal manner. Local managers and supervisors, you may streamline the hiring process uh, by allowing local managers and local supervisors to have large roles to play. But in doing that, you need to make sure that all hiring procedures are being followed strictly. A good practice is obviously to have all three of those levels involved in the recruitment and hiring process. So to kind of summarize what we've talked about up until this point in time, in recruitment, there are a lot of ways that you can do recruitment. There are multiple methods that can be used to attract appropriate candidates. The methods that we choose, though, must meet the requirements of the organization and be capable of hiring individuals who are able to do the job and to then also place a value upon creating a diverse and representative workforce. Also, we have recognized that there are a lot of different entities that are involved in the hiring and recruitment process, whether it be a centralized office, HR coordinator, local leaders within those departments and those units. But whomever is involved, your recruitment process is likely to be most successful if you have a very aggressive but applicant-friendly process that will then help you attract the best and the brightest into these positions. But the natural question, though, is once you've gone through the recruitment process, how do you then decide which candidates you are going to hire? And that is then what leads us into a discussion of the selection in the staffing process. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about selection and the bases and the origin of selection. Selection is based upon selection criteria. And so what criteria are we going to use to select these employees? Historically, there are three different ways in which we have decided how to hire employees to work in the public sector. By social class, and this is something that we'll talk about in a second, that we saw in the era of gentlemen at the founding of the nation running up through the 1820s. And you would hire individuals who came from the best social backgrounds, who had the best social standing, who came from the best educational institutions. And those were the people who were hired then to be the quote unquote bureaucrats in the bureaucracy. Now, today, hiring by social class is generally illegal, and that's something we don't do today, but it was something done in the era of gentlemen to try and legitimize this new fledgling national government. But that's one basis that could be used and was used in the past for selecting employees. The second basis is patronage. And I think we're familiar with this idea of patronage, whereby to the victor go the spoils. And so if you have a winning political party, that winning political party then has the opportunity to select their supporters, those who help them get elected, into these bureaucratic administrative positions. Then there's the basis of merit. And this is essentially kind of where we are at today, and kind of a hybrid version today. But in merit, we hire people who have the qualifications, the knowledge, skills, and abilities necessary in order to do the job. Merit selection is really the very heart of what we call our civil service system, and it really does dominate hiring in the civil service, hiring for public administrators below the very executive leadership positions. So today, when I say we have a hybrid system, the vast majority of our employees are hired based upon merit. They're civil service classified employees. But those who are leading our organizations as secretaries and deputy secretaries of departments, directors of agencies, those tend to still be political appointees. nominated by the president, and in some cases, not all, then required to be confirmed by the Senate. So that's kind of a partisanship level at the very top. And then the vast majority of our employees then tend to be merit-based hires. Within the merit system, we also understand that seniority plays a very big role. It plays a very big role in terms of not just hiring people, but also in terms of promoting as well. We assume that if this is an individual who is already employed in the organization and they're applying for a new position within that organization, you assume since they're already in the organization, they've been through the merit process once, they've been screened through probationary periods already, and hopefully they have superior organizational insight and loyalty because of the length and history of their employment with the organization. So you can kind of see seniority kind of being subsumed within our merit system. We also want to make sure that we are hiring people that will create a representative bureaucracy. Representative bureaucracy either by geography or gender or racial or ethnic groups, prior military service, disability, so on and so on. A lot of people don't realize if they haven't applied for a federal position yet, that if you are a veteran and you have to take an examination for this position in the federal civil service, there is what's called veterans preference. And so if you are a veteran, you will then have a certain amount of points, oftentimes 5 or 7 points, added on to your score in recognition of your military service to, again, it's a different way of serving. So you served your country in the military. Now you're serving your country as a civil servant. And every year, the Office of Personnel Management and the Merit System Protection Board provide a survey of the entire federal bureaucracy, looking at not just the who are federal bureaucrats, but how satisfied and happy those federal bureaucrats are. And when they ask the question of who are the federal bureaucrats, it's always striking to see the percentage of federal bureaucrats who have military service. And it typically is somewhere in the range of about 26, 27, 28% of the federal bureaucracy are veterans. And so we do have that military type of preference that's provided to people who have that military service. But we want to create this broad, very representative bureaucracy. Ostensibly, the more representative the bureaucracy, the better it can then serve a very diverse population. Character, job, and organization fit. Another basis for selection of employees. This is a much looser, much more subjective type of concept, where we look at the match of the expectations of the person with those of the job and the organization. We use character, job, and organization fit usually at the very latter stages of selection. This will be used among finalists. So all these finalists, we have 3 or 5 finalists. They've all made it through the process. They all clearly have the requisite knowledge, skills, and abilities to do the job. The question then is, how do they fit within the organization, and how well do they fit to this position? Now, the way in which we select people to work in civil service today is much different than how we used to select people to work in the bureaucracy. As I mentioned before, our first era of selection was the era of gentlemen, from the founding of the nation up until the 1820s, and specifically up until the Andrew Jackson administration. In the era of gentlemen, we were hiring people based upon their quote unquote fitness of character, their social class, their standing in society, their educational background. We were hiring gentlemen to serve in these positions who would then have the respect of the public. And you think about the national government in the late 1700s and the early 1800s, there was a lot of question as to whether or not this national government was going to persist. And you think about the War of 1812 and Washington being burned by British troops. And so there's a lot of concern about the legitimacy of the national government. The thought process was hiring these people who are well respected in society would add that legitimacy to the national government. Then we had the corrupt bargain. Now, if you're familiar with the U.S. history, you know, in the election of 1824, which came to be known as the corrupt bargain, we had Andrew Jackson running against John Quincy Adams, running against Henry Clay, and we had multiple candidates. But the top 3 candidates were Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, and Henry Clay. In the election of 1824, Andrew Jackson got a plurality of the popular vote. Andrew Jackson also got a plurality of the electoral college vote. The problem, though, is the Constitution says that in order to be elected president, you have to get a majority of the electoral college. Andrew Jackson, even though he had a plurality, did not have a majority. And so we all know, according to the Constitution, when no one has a majority in the electoral college, the election then goes into the House of Representatives. So the election was kicked into the House of Representatives. John Quincy Adams got together with Henry Clay, allegedly, and engaged in what's been known as the corrupt bargain, whereby John Quincy Adams agreed to give a cabinet position to Henry Clay if Henry Clay would convince his supporters in the House to throw their support behind John Quincy Adams. Well, their support was thrown behind John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams then was selected as president by the House of Representatives. And then once Adams became president, he then appointed Henry Clay as Secretary of State. So he got his coveted cabinet position. That corrupt bargain obviously was the triggering event to move us from the era of gentlemen and into a new era known as the era of spoils or the era of patronage, from the Jackson administration up until 1883. Andrew Jackson had very much of a belief in this whole idea of to the victor go the spoils, that since he is the only nationally elected position as president, that he and his party should then be able to populate the national government with bureaucrats from their political party. So you got your job based upon who you knew. Did you follow and did you support the right winning candidate and the winning political party? So to kind of make it a little bit baser level, the era of gentlemen was about who you were. So you got your position based upon who you were, your standing in society. Era of spoils and patronage, you got your job based upon who you knew. Did you support the right party? Did you support the winning candidate? Then in 1881, as we oftentimes see in public policy, we had this triggering event. And as you know, with public policy, we tend to make major changes in public policy in this country when there is some type of a galvanizing triggering event that occurs. The galvanizing triggering event that occurred was the assassination of President Garfield in 1881. So the recently elected James Garfield was assassinated by a person by the name of Charles J. Guiteau. Guiteau had written some election speeches, some campaign speeches for James Garfield when he was running for president. There's no evidence that Garfield used any of these speeches. Further, there's no evidence that Garfield even knew any of these speeches existed. And also, there's no evidence that he even knew who Charles J. Guiteau was. But Guiteau felt this is the era of spoils, so therefore I helped Garfield get elected, so I should get a position. And the position he wanted specifically was ambassador to France. Obviously, he did not get that position. So in Guiteau's kind of warped rationality, he thought, well, if I assassinate James Garfield, Garfield's vice president, Chester Arthur, was a very big believer in spoils and patronage. So if I assassinate Garfield, Arthur becomes president. Arthur then gives me my appointment. Well, obviously that didn't happen. Not only did Guiteau not become ambassador to France, he was then convicted for the assassination of James Garfield, and he was then hung for that assassination. But what it did is it really focused public opinion around we need to change the way in which these positions are being doled out. So that then ushered in this idea of the era of merit. And there was a member of the House of Representatives by the name of George Pendleton, who for many years was carrying around with him draft legislation that would change the way we hire civil servants. So we would hire people based upon their knowledge, skills, and abilities as opposed to their party affiliation. He really wasn't getting any traction in the House of getting that bill passed until the assassination of Garfield. That then was a triggering event to get the House and then the Senate to pass the Pendleton Act, then signed by the president. We ended up with the Pendleton Act of 1883. Pendleton Act of 1883 said that we would select people not based upon their party affiliation, but rather we would put together a recruitment and hiring system that would test people based upon their knowledge, skills, and abilities. So this is where we started testing people to make sure they had the abilities necessary in order to do the work. Throughout this era of merit that begins in 1883, from 1883 up to 1912, we had a very rigorous system of open and competitive examinations. And in your introductory course, you probably talked about Woodrow Wilson and his study of administration. And one of the things that Woodrow Wilson tells us in the study of administration is that we here in the US did not create civil service. We did not create merit-based hiring. We borrowed merit-based hiring and a system of civil service from England. And for many years before us, England had civil service system. They had merit-based hiring. The problem, though, was the merit-based hiring that was used in England was a system that was based upon closed examinations, and that not everyone was eligible to sit for these competitive exams to get these positions. We knew that in our political culture, we needed more open exams. So we took the closed British exams and we made them into more open exams. Wilson also tells us that the British civil service system that we borrowed was also kind of a caste-based system in that if you entered the British civil service, you had to enter at the bottom level and then you had to move up. You couldn't enter laterally from the private sector. We knew that was a problem for us as well because we had a much more open political culture. So we took the British civil service system and we transformed it into lateral entry. So if you're in a top management or leadership position in the private sector, you can then enter the public sector at a lateral basis. You have to go down to the bottom and work your way back up. So this is a civil service system that we borrowed and we then modified from England. But again, we relied very much on independent competitive examinations. We established a civil service commission. That civil service commission was then responsible for creating and administering those competitive examinations. They would then keep a record of how people performed and put together a central job register. And they were primarily responsible then for identifying the people who had the merit-based qualifications to then be recruited and selected to work in these positions. From 1912 to 1978, this whole idea of merit really does begin to expand. But along with its expansion is also expansion of employee rights. We start recognizing that people have due process types of rights in terms of seeking these positions, and that people have due process protections for any adverse employment action that was taken against them. And so we start to recognize that it's not just kind of a top-down situation, but it's also a bottom-up situation. And we also have to afford some protections to these employees. So in doing that, we ended up creating different organizations we'll talk about in just a second, such as the Office of Personnel Management, the Merit System Protection Board, the Office of Special Counsel, providing these avenues that employees can use if they feel that they are not being treated fairly and in accordance with these civil service merit-based types of protections. We also in the 1960s started to add in a concern for access, that there was equal access to employment, especially at the federal level. Now, I mentioned Woodrow Wilson before, and you had read Woodrow Wilson's article in your introductory course. One of the things, the negative aspects of Woodrow Wilson, is we know that Woodrow Wilson, from a historical perspective, had several racist tendencies. And Woodrow Wilson really did view civil service in the federal bureaucracy as kind of a way to keep people from underrepresented groups out in the way in which they fashioned their tests and fashioned their examinations. Well, in the 1960s, with the advent of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, things such as the Fair Housing Act, things like the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, we saw all these pieces of legislation being passed by Congress to try and expand access, not just socially, but also expand access to positions in the federal bureaucracy as well. And so this is where diversity starts to become very important and starts to be incorporated within the way in which we hire people to work in the public sector. Again, some of these acts, Civil Rights Act that I already mentioned, Age Discrimination and Employment Act in 1967 and the amendments thereof, Equal Employment Opportunity Act in 1972, Rehabilitation Act in 1973, and then in 1978, this huge piece of legislation known as the Civil Service Reform Act. And this Civil Service Reform Act is really what has created our modern system of civil service post 1978. That brings us into our current era, which is contemporary selection trends from 1978 to the present point in time. So in the Civil Service Reform Act in 1978, we again recognized that we really didn't have a lot of avenues for employees to file grievances if they felt they were being dealt with in an adverse nature in either the recruitment or the selection process or even in their employment process itself. So we created multiple agencies, such as the Office of Personnel Management, Merit System Protection Board, the Office of Special Counsel, the Federal Labor Relations Authority, and then finally what's known as the SES, or the Senior Executive Service. OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, which we still have today, was created as the centralized clearinghouse for recruitment and selection across the federal bureaucracy. So OPM would review and authorize job announcements, position announcements. They would help create examinations. They would help administer those examinations. They would score those examinations and create an eligibility list. And then agencies could hire people off of that eligibility list. So it really became the major human resources management arm for the president over the entire federal bureaucracy. The Merit Systems Protection Board, MSPB, was created as a place that employees could go if they felt that their civil service protections, their merit-based protections, were being violated. So if you felt that you didn't get a position because, or you didn't get a promotion because of something other than a merit-based principle, then you could take that case to the Merit System Protection Board. Merit System Protection Board was a quasi-judicial body that would then go and investigate your claim, would then render a decision based upon that claim, and could then issue punitive penalties to the agency if the agency had violated your civil service requirements. Also within the Merit System Protection Board, the Civil Service Reform Act created the Office of Special Counsel. The OSC, the Office of Special Counsel, within the Merit System Protection Board, was created as a whistleblowing type of agency. So if you saw someone else's merit-based principles being violated, not yours, but someone else, you would then blow the whistle on that practice. You would then report that practice to the Office of Special Counsel. As a quasi-judiciary body, it would go out there and investigate those claims, and then again, could issue penalties to the agency if those claims are verified. The problem with the OSC is that because it was created in the Merit System Protection Board, it didn't have its own staff, it didn't have its own budget. So in the Whistleblower Protection Act, about a decade later, Congress took the OSC out of the Merit System Protection Board and made it its own independent agency with its own staffing and its own independent budget to try and deal with the backlog of cases that OSC was unable to get to. Then you create the Federal Labor Relations Authority. This is a corollary agency to the National Labor Relations Board in the private sector. The Federal Labor Relations Agency oversees all the negotiations and collective bargaining between public employee unions and federal agencies. And it does that for pretty much all federal employees, with the exception of the U.S. Postal Service. U.S. Postal Service employees, because the USPS is a government corporation, their collective bargaining is overseen by the National Labor Relations Board because they kind of look and act like a private corporation. But everything else then in collective bargaining is under the auspices of the Federal Labor Relations Authority. And then finally, we create the Senior Executive Service. Now, I mentioned that we have this hybrid system today where we have our top echelon of leaders of our agencies and departments are political appointees, appointed by the president, oftentimes confirmed by the Senate. Then the vast majority of our employees within our agencies are civil service employees, merit-based hired employees. The problem there is that you had your political appointees who were taking the agencies in a different direction than your career civil servants wanted to go in. Your political appointees, since they are appointed by the president, were oftentimes there to try and foster and promote presidential policy priorities. Well, your civil servants were there for a career. They were there for 30, 35, 40 years. They didn't care a bit about those presidential priorities. They were caring about doing their job in the most equitable and efficient and effective way possible. So you had your political leaders going in one direction, you had your career civil servants going in another direction. So the senior executive service was created to kind of bridge that gap. So you took the very top level of the of the civil service, what we call our GS level 15, 16, and 17 employees, and we put those employees into the senior executive service. Those senior executive service members were then eligible for bonus pay if their organizations performed well, and they gave up in exchange for that bonus pay, they gave up a lot of their civil service protection. So they were kind of like a hybrid type of position in between a political appointee and a career civil servant. So as you can see, the Civil Service Reform Act was a huge whole-scale change to our civil service system, how we select and how we employ people to work in the federal bureaucracy. Agencies more recently have kind of moved more toward decentralization and coming up with some more innovative ways and innovative alternatives around the civil service system. Because the civil service system really does place some limitations and parameters over how managers can lead and how they can manage their employees. If you have civil servants, you have to be very aware of the regulations that impose limitations on how you deal with those individuals, as well as recognizing the collective bargaining agreement that comes out of the collective bargaining process. So because of those limitations imposed upon us by civil service, we have seen some organizations move more toward things like the use of temporary employees. Temporary employees are employees who obviously are without contract tenure. They don't have the same rights and benefits of civil service employees. So managing those individuals, you have a lot more flexibility and latitude. The use of term employees, employees who are appointed for a designated period of time. They have contract and benefits, but they do not have the job tenure that typically comes along with being a true civil service employee. And we've also seen some agencies work around civil service requirements by hiring retirees. And so if you have someone who's already retired, for say they've retired from the military and they have their military pension, but then you can hire them in the federal bureaucracy. They already have that pension. They've already done that work before. They're looking for a little bit of additional retirement income, provide you with a great deal of flexibility in terms of staffing your organizations. And selection has also become very much automated today, in that we have automated screening programs that's allowed us to do selection in a much more efficient and much more effective manner. Now, of great relevance to you in doing some of your assignments for this week is this then discussion about the nuts and bolts of selection. So how do we go about selecting people to work in our agencies? The selection process is primarily made up of 4 different screening phases. Phase 1, the emphasis is placed upon identifying the qualified versus unqualified. So what would then constitute someone who's qualified for this position versus someone who is not qualified for the position? Screening of qualifications oftentimes occurs either by staff, or there are computer program systems that will allow you to screen out certain types of candidates who do not have the requisite qualifications to do the job. Once you have identified those candidates who have the requisite qualifications for doing the job, you move into phase 2. And in phase 2, your goal is to try and locate the most highly qualified individuals. So you can use things such as examinations, assembled tests. Assembled tests are tests in which applicants are required to come to a centralized physical location to take these general aptitude tests, maybe specific work tests, sometimes providing live work examples, but it's something that is done in a centralized place. Another type of test is an unassembled test. Unassembled tests, you will then rank employees based upon whatever items they are able to submit via mail or via email. Again, the whole idea of using these examinations is to try and narrow your interviewer pool down to find the most highly qualified applicants that you will then want to interview in order to determine who are you selecting. Typically in civil service, we use a rule of 3. The rule of 3 is you select your 3 top most qualified candidates, and then those are the 3 candidates that you will then invite in for an interview. Then in phase 3, you will hopefully, going through this interview process, be able to identify the singular candidate who is the one who is best qualified and best prepared for this job opportunity. You not only select your most qualified candidate, but you select backup candidates as well. Because if that top candidate doesn't accept the position, you need to have some qualified backup candidates that you can go to. You'll then end up negotiating then with that top candidate, providing them the job offer, and then negotiating with them. And then in phase 4, the organization will go and confirm the qualifications of the candidate. So once you've selected that candidate, the candidate has accepted the job, you will then do your confirmation. And the confirmation will be things such as your final reference checks, drug testing, medical exams, determining whether or not a probationary period is necessary for this position. If you're getting a job in the federal government, chances are you will have a probationary period that typically lasts for 2 years. During that probationary period, it's much easier to fire people because they don't have their full civil service protections. They don't have those full civil service protections until that probationary period ends. Again, typically in about a 2-year period of time. So as you are hiring these individuals, you are using interviews, but you're also oftentimes using tests as well. And we know that there are problems with examinations in terms of validity. Some of the examinations that we have used, especially at the federal level, such as the old PACE exams, are not terribly valid tests. And so you're not exactly always getting the most qualified individuals who are the ones who are scoring the highest on these examinations. That's one of the reasons why we have kind of moved away from the use of examinations and relying much more on a holistic review of knowledge, skills, and abilities and interviews. But if you still need to use an examination in your selection process, you need to make sure that your examination is a valid exam. There are 3 main types of validity that affect job examinations. The first type of validity is known as content validity. Content validity basically asks the question, is there a direct relationship between what is being asked for on the test and what's being asked for on the job? So is the content of the test similar to the content of the job? And one of the famous guiding Supreme Court cases here is a case from the 1970s called Griggs versus Duke Power Company. In the Griggs versus Duke Power Company case, the examination that was being used for a janitorial custodial job was an examination that included math questions. Math questions that had no bearing whatsoever on the ability to do the job. So the content of the exam didn't match the content of the job. So we need to make sure we have content validity. Second type of validity is criterion validity. Criterion validity looks at the correlation between the score someone gets on a test and how well they perform on the job. So the correlation between their test score and their performance evaluation score. And there are a couple of different ways in which you can do criterion validity. One way is the predictor method. In the predictor method, you would then give people examinations, score them on examinations. You would then hire on a probationary period the top scores, and then also hire the lowest scores, bring them in as probationary employees, and then provide them with a performance evaluation after a certain short period of time. If you have criterion validity, if the high scores on the exam are also the high performers and the low scores on the exam are the low performers, then the exam is a good predictor of future job performance. Then there's the other one that's known as concurrent validity or concurrent validation. In concurrent validation, you reverse the process. So you would look at your employees who are currently employed. You would take your top performers and you would administer the examination that you want to use to hire future employees. You take your lowest performers and administer the examination to them. And again, you're looking for that correlation between job performance and performance on the examination. So either a predictive manner or a concurrent manner are both ways in which you can do criterion validity. Then the third type is construct validity. Construct validity documents the relationship of select abstract personal traits and characteristics to job performance. So things such as persistence. So you measure someone's persistence because that's something that will be effective for them on the job. You measure their ability to work alone, to work without supervision. And so those are kind of those personal traits that you have associated with excellence on the job. And so you'll then test people on those types of types of characteristics and personality characteristics to make sure they have those types of characteristics that will lead to success on the job. Like I said, we've really kind of moved away from the use of examinations, especially at the federal level, and now we're doing more of a holistic examination of people's education and experience. Information we can glean from their applications, from their cover letters, from their resumes, much more of a holistic type of approach. We will review their letters of recommendation from former employers or sometimes from peers to make sure that what they're telling us and how they performed in the past is actually how they have really performed in the past. Sometimes we will do self-assessments to try and measure their quantifiable types of capabilities, but it's a much more subjective way and a much more holistic way of reviewing candidates for the purpose of selection. Again, we have moved away from tests. Sometimes we will use psychological tests. Sometimes we'll use general skill tests. Sometimes we'll use general physical ability of tests if there are a lot of physical requirements to a certain type of job. Sometimes we'll have specific tests for specific jobs. So you think about something like if it's a job that requires a lot of coding with computers. In order to do a good job, you're going to have to be able to do that type of coding and know how you do that coding. So you have a very specific test that will test your ability to code. Sometimes we'll use these assessment centers that I have mentioned before. We'll bring people in maybe on a Saturday morning to an assessment center, and we will then have them do the type of work that they'll be doing on the job. Couple problems with assessment centers. One is they're very costly because you're setting up a simulated work environment. And number two, you also have what we know very well in public administration and social science research as the Hawthorne effect. Whenever you're watching someone, they know they're being watched and they're going to behave differently than if they're not being watched. So chances are their productivity in these assessment centers will be at a much higher level than it would be if they're actually hired into the position. So what we have to think about is we have to think about, do we want to use a more holistic review of education and letters of recommendation and experience, or do we want to select based upon testing? It really does depend upon the position. If it's a very special position, specialized position with specialized types of skills, we may still have to rely upon examinations. If it's a position that doesn't require those specialized like coding skills, we may want to rely more on the holistic review of education and experience. So we always interview people as part of our selection process. And so interviewing, because it's something that involves human beings, is wrought with error. And so what we need to do is make sure that we prepare very well for these interviews. We want to make sure that we practice the interviews, and that's true for both the interviewer as well as the interviewee. For interviewees, they need to do their research before these interviews. They need to research the organization, understand what the organization is, what the organization does, the types of employees who work in the organization. Do your research before you sit for those interviews. Listen well during the interviews and make sure that you are answering the questions. The prospective employee needs to be answering the questions that are being asked of that prospective employee. Not being able to capably balance technical and non-technical aspects of the job opportunity. Understand that there are both the technical aspects as well as the non-technical social aspects of the job. And obviously looking the part and dressing for success and making sure that the person who's interviewing you can see you in that position. Interviews can be conducted by supervisors. They can be conducted by the human resource department. They can be conducted by panels. And typically that's what we use is we'll use a panel or committee, oftentimes made up of people, stakeholders from within the department, as well as representatives from the HR department. Involving the HR department, obviously, will, as we said before, help keep you in line with legal requirements as you go through the interviewing process. The people you are interviewing obviously are going to be your semifinalists or your finalist candidates. So you know they've at least not only met the minimum standards for the job, but they have some of the characteristics necessary that could make them the most qualified person for that position. As you conduct the interviews, you need to have a plan in place in terms of the questions you ask, the sequencing of those questions. The questions you ask, the sequencing of the questions needs to be the same for all of the applicants. If it is not, then you run the risk of violating the rights of candidates. So you have to make sure that everything is comparable between all the interviews for all the different candidates. It's one of the reasons why if we have a candidate who says, well, I can't be there in person, so I need to do it via Zoom, that's an option that has to be provided to all of your candidates because it's kind of difficult to compare those apples and those oranges. The position should be well explained to the candidate so the candidate understands the position because that understanding will then help form their answers to those questions. The position description itself and the position advertisement should serve as your touchstones and your major basis for your guide in the essential functions of that job that you'll be covering then in that interview. Interviews should be done in a location absent distractions. Concentration on the applicant's responses so you can then compare responses because all these interviews aren't being done at the exact same time. So you're going to have notes and be able to compare the responses and make sure again that, and this is can't be overemphasized, that the questions you use are uniform and they're asked of all the candidates in the same fashion, in the same sequencing. It's also good practice to emphasize behaviorally anchored questions that really relate to the behaviors that are expected once hired into the job to be successful. Avoid any oral commitments or suggestions about employment prospects. Oftentimes, one of the last questions that prospective employees will ask is, well, what's the process and where am I at in the process? You can describe the process, you can describe where you're going in the process, but you shouldn't make any types of commitments to that individual about, oh, but you're going to get the job, or oh, but you're going to be our finalist. Keep the interview questions focused on the job itself, obviously not asking any questions about family or any personal types of questions such as that. Be prepared and able to make accommodations for applicants upon request in compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act, and keep complete evaluation notes so that you are able to remember what was covered in the interview and then be able to compare responses from employees. Once we have identified the prospective employee we think is most qualified, we then have to conduct our reference checks. Now, reference checks can be done in a couple different ways. They can be done before interviewing, they can be done after interviewing, or you can kind of do a combination of the both. Do the reference checks immediately before as well as immediately after, maybe a couple before, a couple after. It really depends upon the sequencing of your selection process. Typically, what we tend to do is we tend to do them after the interview process. So we have our three finalists, we interview our three finalists, we rank those three finalists, and then we go out there and conduct the reference checks. When you do these reference checks, you're actually contacting the person who is listed as a referee or the person who wrote the letter of recommendation. You will want to not only talk to that person about the candidate's abilities and their skills, but you want to verify their employment with their employer, the dates in which they were employed, their responsibilities, their job title, get a general assessment of the strengths and the weakness of the person, examples of the person's abilities. Was the candidate given additional responsibilities? Did the candidate seek out additional responsibilities? Is the candidate eligible for advancement in their position? Is the candidate eligible for rehiring? This is an important one, that if this person would leave, would this person then be eligible to be rehired into that position? And so you want to do these comprehensive background checks. And oftentimes in the high selection process, there will be a place in the selection process where you will have to confirm the reference checks that you conducted, what day, what time you conducted those reference checks, and who you conducted those reference checks with. Then once the employee is selected, you then enter into negotiations with that employee in terms of here, once you've negotiated with them, they come to an agreement. Here is your verbal offer. In addition to that verbal offer, then after that person accepts that verbal offer, there should be a written letter of intent that then follows that employee can then sign that they are accepting that offer from the organization. Obviously, the HR department should be very involved in this entire process. Once that person has signed their letter of intent, Then the process turns over to the Human Resources Department, and they will then ensure the completion of all the attendant hiring paperwork. And that kind of then takes us all the way through this selection process. So recruitment and selection are both very important steps in terms of staffing our organizations. There's no one right or wrong way to do recruiting and to do selection. It really depends upon the organization, the type of position that is being filled, the target population that you are targeting in terms of trying to hire people from. All those things will be very contextual in nature. And so, just like everything else in public administration, there is no one right or wrong answer. There is no one panacea. It really depends upon the situation the organization finds itself within. So I know this has been relatively long, and I apologize for that, but kind of give you some of the insights in terms of how we recruit and how we select as public organizations. This is information that you'll then be using to do your 2 assignments for this week. And I have a separate video that's also appended here to the learning activities for week 2 that will provide you with some more specifics in terms of both of those assignments. If you have any questions about any of this information, as always, feel free to send me an email. Otherwise, I hope everyone has a great week, and I look forward to reading your work. Take care and have a great week, everyone.